Hey everyone, it's Sevi. Welcome to my guide on our Madam Guardian Bronya rand. This video will cover her kit, Eidolons, Relic and Lightcone builds, and teams as usual, but more importantly, the essentials of understanding her rotations and speed tuning mechanics to help you better maximize her support capabilities. It's a long one, so let's dive in. Bronya is a 5-star Wind Harmony unit that has proven herself deserving of the 5-star status thanks to her extremely potent buffs and turn-advancing utility. Let's quickly summarize Bronya's kit and traces first. Bronya's skill targets an ally to cleanse them of 1 debuff, make them immediately take their turn, and give a huge 1-turn damage bonus. The cleanse is obviously very useful, especially for getting rid of disabling or crowd control debuffs on your allies, but more importantly, her immediate turn plus damage bonus enables your DPSs to significantly boost their turn frequency and damage output. Let's use a quick example. In this cycle, Bronya is taking her turn right before Blade since she's faster. If I used her skill, she gives the damage bonus and cleanse, but the advance effect isn't utilized as well since Blade was already moving next anyway. However, in this scenario, Blade is taking his turn ahead of Bronya, so right after that I can use Bronya's skill to make him take an immediate turn right after his previous one, which gives him more potential damage output in a shorter amount of time. Of course, this utility doesn't strictly have to be for boosting damage. For example, you might want your healer to take their turn now since you need healing ASAP, or maybe you want a specific element to break the enemy. The flexibility of Bronya's skill advance can certainly have many uses. Remember as well that by advancing a unit's turn faster, that will also consume 1 turn of any timed buffs they have sooner, so be aware of how it affects any buffs you're trying to manage. It also means that their shield ticks down sooner, so be mindful of that in case it might affect your defensive needs. Anyway, we'll discuss how to make better use of her skill's advancing mechanics more in the rotations and speed tuning sections. If you use it on Bronya herself, she will still get cleansed, but she cannot give herself the turn advance. Instead, you get this close-up animation of Bronya judging you for your life choices. As for her ultimate, which costs 120 energy, it gives a huge attack and crit damage bonus to the entire team for 2 turns. The crit damage bonus partially scales on Bronya's own crit damage, which incentivizes building crit damage on her. It's a straightforward buff, but a huge damage boost nonetheless, especially when lined up with her skill's damage buff. Then her talent is also a valuable gameplay aspect. She advances herself by a certain amount when using her basic attack, and while it might seem similar to increasing a unit's speed, there is a fundamental difference between increasing a unit's speed versus advancing them. If you're not familiar with that yet, I recommend checking out other guides that explain this in more detail. But let's just do a basic demonstration of how it works. Here, Zila currently has 151 speed and Bronya has 121, which makes their action values, or AV, about 66 and 83 respectively, calculated by the following formula. Everyone's turn rate is determined by their AV constantly accumulating in the action queue. A higher speed means a lower AV, putting them closer to the top of the queue, which is why a higher speed lets a unit move sooner. AV can be affected by changes in speed from buffs or debuffs, or by an advanced forward effect. If I advance Bronya by 26%, then we multiply her 83 AV by 74% and it becomes 61 instead for that next turn. Anyway, their AV gap is currently 17. I'll advance her, which causes her AV to change from 83 to 61. Then when you factor in their new AVs, the new gap will be about 12, showing that Bronya did get forwarded in the queue closer to Zila. By knowing the basics of advanced forwarding, you can better predict and control Bronya's position in the action queue. I'll discuss more of this in the speed tuning section. For a quick summary of the rest of Bronya's traces, her technique increases all allies' attack by 15% for 2 turns at the start of battle. You'll definitely want to use this in tough battles. Her A2 bonus ability makes her basic attack have a 100% increased crit rate, so building crit rate is irrelevant. A4 gives a temporary defense bonus at the start of battle, and A6 gives a permanent damage bonus buff to your team. All these abilities just make her an even more stacked support. As for stat bonuses, she gets wind damage bonus, crit damage, and effect resistance, all of which are quite useful for her. When you're prioritizing which traces to level up first, go for her ultimate and skill, as they are her main buff sources. These are followed by her talent level, which increases the advance forward percent. Her basic attack levels are a small damage gain, but it's the lowest priority. Now onto Bronya's rotation and speed tuning. While this might seem like the trickiest part of her gameplay, it doesn't have to be too difficult or complicated. With a bit of basic understanding from discussion and practical examples, we can simplify these aspects so that you can get your Bronya well optimized to your liking. To start, one concern is if you're going for a skill point heavy playstyle, wherein Bronya more frequently uses her skill, or a more conservative or neutral playstyle where she balances her basic attacks and skills more. There are of course pros and cons to both. A skill heavy playstyle playstyle can yield higher damage potential since you're aggressively buffing and refreshing your DPS's turn. But depending on your team's skill point economy, this playstyle may not always be ideal or sustainable. In order to effectively maintain this, she'll want enough teammates that are skill point positive or neutral to feed Bronya's skill usage. Her signature light cone and/or Eidolon, which have skill point generating mechanics, can also help a lot if you have them. On the other hand, your rotation can alternate her basic attack and skill use more, which results in a skill point conservative or even completely neutral playstyle. The main advantage is she becomes a more sustainable unit in terms of skill point consumption, which leaves more room and flexibility for her teammates' skill point needs. Even if the trade-off is lower damage potential, at least you won't easily find yourself running out of skill points. Additionally, her energy generation will also be affected depending on your rotation. Basic attacks generate less energy, though certain light cone equipment can make basic attacks generate more energy than the normal. Of course, you don't need to strictly adhere to one playstyle. Planning ahead helps, but you should always adapt to the situation if you'll be more conservative or aggressive with using her skill, which you can get used to with experience. Another aspect of optimizing Bronya is speed tuning, so you can effectively utilize her skill's instant turn mechanic. First, be aware of your team's speed stats to see how Bronya falls in the turn order. Let's use a simple team example with the following speed values. You also have to account for speed buffs. Like in the case of hunt units, all of them have some form of innate speed buffs. Here, Zila's default speed is 122, but when she uses her skill, she gets a huge 25% speed bonus, which totals to 151. Speed debuffs from your enemies will also affect your unit's order, so be wary of enemies that can inflict those. This sample Bronya is slower than the Zila with a fairly wide gap. Slower doesn't necessarily mean her speed is very low, just that she is slower relative to a target unit. We can, in theory, push these units to be faster, but for now, let's stick to this. Anyway, let's go more in depth with demonstrations. Here, it's the start of the battle with the unit's turn order corresponding to their speed stats. Using Zila's skill activates her speed buff, and you can see that in the preview of her next turn, she's already overtaken Silverwolf and Locha. If I use Bronya's skill, that will bump up Zila and give her an immediate turn. You'll see in the new turn order preview that she disappears from her supposed order and takes her instant turn. However, since Zila is fast enough, her next turn will still take place ahead of Silverwolf. So, assuming I use Bronya's skill every time, the turn order onwards will look like this. Effectively, it's like Zila's taking an extra turn than she normally would have, and Bronya's turn advance gets a lot of mileage. But depending on your skill point economy, you may want to adopt a more skill point neutral playstyle that alternates Bronya's skill and basic attacks. Let's see that in action instead. In this cycle, look at the AV gap between Zila and Bronya. It's currently at 17. I'll use Bronya's basic attack to generate a point and advance her. In the next cycle, Bronya has advanced ahead of Silverwolf and Locha, but still maintains her position behind Zila. Notice that the AV gap has changed into 12 as well, indicating that Bronya is now closer to Zila in terms of the AV queue. Now I'll alternate back to Bronya's skill to give Zila her immediate turn. In the next cycle, look at their AV gap. It's back to the original 17, but why is that? Imagine that whenever Bronya advances a unit to immediately take her turn, she also drags that unit at the same position in the turn order. Both of them will technically have a 0 AV difference at that moment. Since Zila has 66 AV and Bronya has 83, when those are added up for the next turn, the difference is 17 AV. This is one way that Bronya maintains or resets her synchrony with a target unit. For example, let's reset this battle where instead of using Bronya's skill at the first turn, she uses her basic attack instead. I get the skill point, but for now, Bronya advanced herself so much that she is now moving ahead of Zila. But if I use Bronya's skill on Zila in this next cycle, observe what happens afterwards. Bronya is now moving behind Zila with an AV gap of 17. Their AVs relative to each other get reset back to default due to the mechanic discussed earlier. You can think of this as sort of locking or intertwining them together, and by utilizing this, you'll be able to keep Bronya behind your target DPS at a consistent rate. Here's another scenario that can potentially happen if Bronya and your target's speed stats are too close. I'll re-gear Bronya so that her speed is now at 144, while Zila's still at 151 with the buff. Let's assume I want to use a basic attack plus skill playstyle. This turn, I'll use Bronya's basic to generate the skill point and advance her. However, in the next turn cycle, this has moved her ahead of Zila because their speeds were too close. To fix this, you can resync her by using a skill or doing another basic attack to advance her closer to Zila's turn. Thankfully, you can prevent this accidental overtake from her advance forward by setting her speed speed at the right amount of slow. A quick way to calculate this is by taking 100% minus half of her talent's advance forward multiplier percent. Or you can just remember the upper limit of 85%, which accommodates Bronya's highest talent level. So for example, if Seele has 151 speed, 85% of that is 128. So that will be my safe maximum speed target for Bronya. That's a big enough gap to prevent her basic attack from overtaking Seele. Now, so far, the previous discussion assumes that Bronya has a slower build, and generally speaking, I highly recommend that approach since it's the most convenient and manageable. However, if you do have the gear, it's technically possible to make Bronya fast enough to greatly increase the number of turns she takes while still being mostly in sync with your DPS. But in order to achieve an ideal alignment with your DPS while doing a skill point neutral rotation, Bronya's maximum speed stat would be 200% minus her talent's advance forward percent in relation to your DPS's speed stat. So at 30% advance forward, her speed limit is 170% of your DPS's. To see this in practice, we'll take this Bronya with 26% advance forward and make her target a slow unit like Clara. In this scenario, Clara's speed is 90 and Bronya's ideal speed is 174% of that. That would be 156 speed, but 154 is the highest my equipment will allow. But since we're very close to the speed ratio anyway, Bronya's basic attack positions her right behind Clara, leaving only a tiny AV gap between them. So when Bronya uses her skill on Clara, you're getting high value out of that advance forward, and they can continue in sync like this. If you go higher than that ratio, Bronya's basic will advance her ahead of the target DPS already, which isn't ideal. Now what happens if you fall below that 170+% speed ratio? Simply put, the AV gap after Bronya does her basic attack will get larger. In this scenario, Blade has 97 speed while Bronya has 125 speed. From this first basic attack, Bronya still becomes the next ally after Blade. But by this basic attack, she's fallen behind another ally instead of right after Blade. It's not the end of the world, but larger AV gaps decrease the value of Bronya's skill advanced forward. But a 170% speed ratio will take a lot of stat investment, so you can instead just settle for hitting high speed breakpoints with Bronya, such as the 150 to 160 range. This will at least get Bronya to take much more frequent turns, which is overall a net positive for skill point generation and advancing your DPS. She may not always end up right behind your DPS after she uses her basic attack, but that's alright. And if desynchronization happens, you know by now that using her skill will reset their AV gap. There are definitely a lot of scenarios that vary from player to player, but hopefully these examples made it a little bit clearer how Bronya's turn advancing mechanics work. A lot of this can be theoretically calculated, which requires the time and knowledge to do so, but that's likely not something you're willing to do, and if you knew how to, you probably didn't need this discussion. So instead, you can simply remember the basics, do some light speed tuning, and conduct practical tests, preferably in a non-threatening environment like I did, so that you can work out your Bronya's dynamics in that specific team and adjust as necessary. With a little bit of patience, making Bronya work well and optimized for you need not be a difficult task. Now let's take a quick look at what her Eidolons add, if you're lucky enough to get them. E1 gives Bronya a 50% chance of recovering a skill point when she uses her skill with a 1-turn cooldown if it activates. It's definitely a nice quality of life addition to improve your skill point economy when it does trigger, and can help manage a more skill point hungry playstyle. E2 makes her skill give a huge 1-turn 30% speed increase after the target ally from her skill takes their immediate turn. It depends on your unit speed tuning how this will impact your turn order and frequency. Calculate or test this Eidolon's effect and adjust accordingly. E3 gives an ultimate and talent level increase. E4 lets Bronya do a follow-up attack when an ally does a basic attack on a wind-weak enemy. It's not as impactful as her previous Eidolons, but it's still nice since Bronya can contribute more damage and break the enemy faster. E5 gives her a skill and basic attack level increase. And finally, E6 extends her skill's damage bonus buff duration by 1 turn, so it can extend beyond the target's advanced turn. It also makes her have better buffing synergy with most units, especially ones that could not take full advantage of the damage bonus buff due to its 1-turn limitation, like Jingyuan's Lightning Lord. Now let's move on to Bronya's relic build, starting with her stats. For her body, she wants crit damage since this will improve her ultimate's crit damage buff and her own damage output. For her feat, it's subject to your preference and speed tuning goals. Keeping in mind the principles discussed in her speed tuning section, you can control how much speed Bronya gets by putting on a speed piece of the appropriate level. It's also not a bad idea to keep different levels of speed boots so that you can adapt her to have either more or less speed. However, if speed substat rolls will already suffice, then you can opt for defense, HP, or attack instead, depending if you want more survivability or damage. damage. Among those options, I would highly suggest going for defense or HP. Bronya's damage contribution isn't really that much, all things considered, and if you're using her in a skill-heavy playstyle, then she'll barely use her basic attacks. Keeping Bronya alive and ready to buff and cleanse your team is a bigger priority. It's the same case for her Planar sphere. HP or defense is highly recommended, but if you do really want the offense, then wind damage or attack is always an option. As for the rope, I recommend energy regeneration to give you more energy flexibility to switch between skill point neutral or hungry rotations. As for substats, look for speed as needed and crit damage. Don't ignore effect resistance too to help her better resist those annoying debuffs. And now with the Broken Keel set, getting effect resistance also has the added purpose of unlocking its effect. After that, defense and HP are great for more survivability. Attack and break effect have their offensive uses but are very low priority. Once you know what main and substats to aim for, then consider her Relic Sets. The 4-piece Messenger Traversing Hackerspace is a new top set option. It gives her a 6% speed bonus to help with her speed target, and she can trigger the 4-piece effect to buff your entire team's speed for 1 turn. With this, Bronya has more potent buffing utility. A second option, though trickier, is the 4-piece Eagle of Twilight line. When Bronya uses her ultimate, she gets a 25% advance forward effect. You have to account how it will affect her position in the turn order and make adjustments. If ever it messes up your desired order, you'd have to resync her. But if you don't want to deal with that hassle, then avoid this set. The third option is the 4-piece Musketeer of Wild Wheat. It gives the same 6% speed bonus as Messenger, but it buffs the user's attack and basic attack damage. I would much rather recommend the 4-piece Messengers for better support benefits. If you don't have your desired full set yet, you can simply go for 2-piece sets of the following, or just a rainbow build that gives her good stats. As for Planar ornaments, the Broken Keel is a top-tier set for her. Combined with Bronya's effect resistance trace bonuses, hitting the 30% requirement is quite easy. The crit damage bonus helps both her own ult's crit damage scaling and directly buffing your team, and makes Celestial Differentiator obsolete on Bronya since Broken Keel will result in a better overall crit damage buff. Another still solid alternative is the Fleet of the Ageless. It gives HP for survivability and, more importantly, a team-wide attack buff if she has at least 120 speed for boosting overall team damage. A third, though situationally viable set is the Sprightly Von Whack. The ERR bonus can help hit high ERR targets combined with an ERR rope and or energy light cones. Its one-time advance forward bonus can also give your Bronya a head start in the turn order, which can help with a Fast Bronya build and potentially give an extra basic attack at the start. Now let's go through Bronya's light cone recommendations and their advantages. Among the 3 stars, Chorus and Meshing Cogs are the best picks. Chorus gives a permanent attack bonus to your entire team, while Meshing Cogs gives energy whenever the user attacks or gets hit. Of course, it depends on your rotation playstyle and enemy targeting RNG how much value Bronya will get from Meshing Cogs. In a skill spam playstyle, Bronya will barely take advantage of the extra energy and probably rely more on getting hit. Either way, both are good choices. Moving on to the 4-star options. Past and Future is a great free-to-play option that's purchasable from the Forgotten Hall shop. It has a synergistic effect with Bronya's kit since it gives a damage bonus buff to the next ally moving after the user's skill, which stacks with her own buff too. Planetary Rendezvous will give a team-wide wind damage buff when equipped on Bronya, which is only recommended if you're using her with a wind DPS. Compared to Past and Future, this has the advantage of at least buffing wind attacks outside of her skill effect. Dance 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 is a solid all-around light cone. It advances the entire team whenever the user casts their ultimate, which can potentially let you get in more overall turns before the enemies or in MOC cycles. Memories of the Past gives break effect, which has very limited use on Bronya, but it regenerates energy when Bronya attacks. Unlike Meshing Cogs though, you have to rely on her basic attacks to proc the effect, which limits its functionality on her. Carve the Moon, Weave the Clouds is a battle pass reward that gives a random team buff every turn, which are all useful. If you're a BP spender, this is one of the better light cones to get as a universally great harmony light cone. So if you have the previous options anyway, this can very much suffice and be just as good or situationally better. Finally, the 5-star standard light cone, but the battle isn't over, is her overall best in slot. It gives the user very high base stats, ERR, and a damage bonus buff to the next unit after using her skill. It also helps with Bronya's SP management thanks to its SP generating effect. Finally, let's summarize Bronya's team considerations and synergies. Her team template will pair her with a DPS she'll focus on advancing and buffing along with a survival unit. The 4th flex slot can accommodate different roles according to preference. It can be a Harmony or Nihilistic utility unit to enhance your team's damage and provide various support utilities. It could be another DPS or a hybrid tank DPS, or if you really want utmost comfort, another survival unit. Whatever team she's in, Bronya provides single target buffing with her skill and team-wide buffing with her ultimate and bonus abilities, giving her amazing support coverage. Be mindful as well of Bronya's skill point needs. If you're going for a skill-heavy Bronya, you'll want to have SP positive and or neutral teammates to feed her SP usage. Otherwise, Bronya can maintain a mostly SP neutral playstyle to better enable other SP hungry teammates. With hunt units, Bronya is going to be a deadly combo with any of them. The Zilla and Bronya duo was one of the strongest combos upon release, and that's true even now. Aside from her just being an insane DPS, Zilla's Resurgence talent can even retain one-turn buffs like Bronya's skill damage bonus, since the extra Resurgence turn doesn't consume buff durations. Like Zilla, Sushang also has turn manipulation mechanics, so Bronya complements them both even further and lets them take a ton of consecutive turns, so you ought to be conscious of their skill point needs. As for Danheng, it's very satisfying lining up her buffs with Danheng's own buffs to deal crazy nuke damage. Yanqing buffs his own crit rate among other stats, so he can enjoy Bronya's crit damage boost without as much stat investment. However, since you usually play Yanqing with a shielder to prevent him from taking damage, just be mindful that Bronya can make Yanqing's shield duration tick down sooner by advancing him. Among our destruction roster, Bronya is essentially Blade's best support right now. As a heavily HP scaling character, Blade benefits much more from damage bonuses and crit buffs than attack buffs, and since Blade isn't as skill point hungry, Bronya can use her skill more often and readily provide him that damage bonus. Hook and Physical Trailblazer will synergize well with Bronya. However, Arlen has the same concern with Yanqing, wherein you usually play him with a shielder since you want to keep him at low health, so be mindful of any shield's duration when Bronya is advancing him. If Clara is paired with Bronya, it's either Clara is acting as a hyper carry in the team or as a tank DPS, while Bronya is more focused on supporting another DPS. A lot of Clara's damage comes from follow-up attacks, so Bronya's skill buff can't affect them outside of Clara's turn unless you have Bronya's E6. At least her ultimate buffs can though. For our erudition roster, they generally have no problem synergizing with Bronya too. One huge concern though is with Jingyuan, who has pros and cons with Bronya. The main con is that Bronya's skill buff can never be applied to Lightning Lord since it expires as soon as the buff unit takes their turn unless you have her E6. However, the main pro is that Jingyuan is able to take his turn sooner to give Lightning Lord more stacks. This can be helpful if your Jingyuan is unable to stack enough speed to get him to a good breakpoint. Of course, you can always try using Bronya in unconventional situations. If you also want to maximize a unit's damage that isn't typically built as a main DPS, you can definitely try using Bronya to push their damage potential. And that's all for this guide. Let me know in the comments what you think of Bronya, whether you already have her or are hoping to lose a 50-50 to her. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!